Okay, let me welcome you tonight to the third annual Sam Hill Lecture in Southern Religious History. My name is Roger Payne. I'm the chair of the Department of Religious Studies here at UNC Asheville, which is one of the co-sponsors for tonight's lecture. I'd like to begin by thanking our other co-sponsors. One is the Department of History, which has been very supportive of this lecture series, but especially tonight to say a word of thanks to Dr. Rick Chess and the Center for Jewish Studies. Whose very generous financial support made tonight's lecture possible. Dr. Chess has very modestly given me all of the hosting activities tonight. Thanks, Rick. But it's no exaggeration to say that without the support of the Center for Jewish Studies, given our trying financial times, it's quite possible that we would not have been able to present a lecture this year. So it is really through their support that we're able to be here tonight and to have a scholar of the caliber that we have speaking to you tonight. Before I say a few words about the lecture and then introduce our speaker, I've got a few announcements that I'd like to make. First of all, we are videotaping the lecture tonight, and this will include the question and answer session afterwards. So I've been asked to ask you if you have a question for our speaker. During that time, there will be students in both of the aisles who will have a microphone. And if you would like to ask a question, they will bring you the microphone, and if you will speak into that, that will allow us then to be sure that your comments, your questions are being recorded. Also, Malaprop's bookstore is here tonight with some of Dr. Ferris's books. They are, I understand, up this way, so if you go out this side, you may miss them. So if you're interested in visiting the Malaprop's table, if you will exit over here on this side, but don't leave yet. We have some other things going on. Finally then, there is some information on the table you may have seen as you came in tonight, information about the Center for Jewish Studies, about Jewish studies in the South, and also some cards that if you are interested in receiving information on the Sam Hill Lecture Series, on any of the speakers and activities that we have within the Department of Religious Studies. If you would fill out one of these cards and just leave it on the table in the back or give it to me if you see me. What I do is try and email and let folks know when we're having speakers they may be interested in hearing. I promise not to spam you. In fact, some of you are already on the list, and you should be aware, of course, that I don't send out a lot of emails. But if you are interested, by all means, let us have that information tonight. So, let me begin by saying just a few words about the Sam Hill Lectures themselves. There are several ideas that lay behind the creation of the Sam Hill Lecture in Southern Religious History. The lecture series was conceived as a way to bring every year to this campus one of the top scholars in the field of Southern Religious Studies, where she or he could offer a public lecture as well as meet informally with students and faculty. Thus, the lecture is designed to support UNC Asheville's mission as a place of engaged student learning, based in part upon the interaction of students and faculty, as well as to participate then in what we term public scholarship of the highest order. In a political climate where the word intellectual all too often carries a negative, shall we even say elitist connotation, we are confident that the honest work of scholarship, the exchange or even the contest of ideas, the questioning of assumptions and orthodoxies, and the recognitions that we Americans speak with many, many voices are values to be embraced and cherished by the community at large. So we're very happy that those of you who are from the Asheville community and nearby locales have joined with us here tonight to engage in this work. The lecture series is also designed to honor a man, a Southerner, a scholar, a Kentucky native but an almost native North Carolinian, who first began to shape the field of Southern religious studies less than half a century ago. Sam Hill was for many years a professor of religious studies at the University of Florida, but not before earning his PhD at Duke University and going from there to help to found the Department of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. After a long and distinguished career as an educator, a teacher, a mentor, and a scholar, Sam and his wife Helen returned during their retirement to North Carolina, and they still own a home in nearby Black Mountain, although they're now spending most of the year back in Florida once again for health reasons. A list of Sam's many accomplishments would take too long for our time here tonight, but suffice it to say that for those of us who study, research, and teach about religion in the South, we know that our debt to Sam Hill is enormous. I'm very pleased that he has consented to allow us the privilege of naming this lecture series after him, and it is my hope that these lectures will not only inspire future scholars of Southern religious studies, but they will promote the legacy of Sam Hill to many future generations of undergraduate students here at UNC Asheville. And now let me introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Marcy Cohen Ferris is an associate professor and coordinator of the Southern Studies program in the Department of American Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her research and teaching interests include the history of the Jewish South, food and American culture, American Jewish women's history, and the foodways and material culture of the American South. She's a distinguished teacher and scholar, as evidenced by her many awards and accolades. She was the recipient in 2007 of the University of North Carolina's Tanner Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Education. And from 2006 until 2008, she served as the president of the Southern Foodways Alliance at the very prestigious Center for Southern Culture, for the study of Southern culture at the University of Mississippi. In addition to her teaching and service, Dr. Ferris is a well-known scholar who has published numerous books and articles on the cultural, social, and economic practices that relate to food and foodways in the American South, in particular, of course, in the culinary culture of Southern Jewish life. Indeed, her presentation tonight, Matzoh Ball Gumbo, Culinary Tales of the Jewish South, comes from her award-winning book by the same title, which was published by UNC Press in 2005. Matzoh Ball Gumbo won the 2006 Jane Grigson Award, presented by the International Association of Culinary Professionals for distinguished scholarship and research in presentation, and it was also nominated for the 2006 James Beard Foundation Award in the category of Writing on Food. Since the publication of Matzoh Ball Gumbo, Dr. Ferris has continued her research in the study of Jewish history, foodways, and cultures in the American South. In 2006, she co-edited a collection of contemporary scholarship in the Jewish South entitled Jewish Roots in Southern Soil, A New History, which was published by the University Press of New England. See, as I tell my students in class all the time, the South is one of the few areas where everybody in the country is studying us, right? That may be good or bad, I don't know. Her current work, The Edible South, Food and History in an American Region, is a social history of Southern foodways that explores both the mythic and the daily meaning of food in the lives of generations of Southerners. A related project that she is co-editing concerns the foodways of North Carolina and will be a collection of essays by scholars, food writers, and journalists who examine the state's history and culture through its distinctive regional foodways. There may be a word or two in there about barbecue, I imagine. Kosher barbecue, of course. There are many other titles tonight that I might mention, but I'm afraid that to list all of her publications would take up too much time, and you are here to hear her and not me. There is, however, one final title that I want to mention because it has a great deal to do with why Dr. Ferris is here with us tonight. Shortly before I came to UNC Asheville in 2007, I was working as a co-editor on a collection of articles on religion in the South entitled Southern Crossroads. It was published eventually by University of Kentucky Press in 2008. I worked on this with Walt Conzer of UNC Wilmington, who was my co-editor, and when we were discussing the articles that we wanted to include in this volume, this is when I had the opportunity first to acquaint myself with Dr. Ferris's work. Walt and I quickly agreed that a book intended to demonstrate the many ways in which religion and culture intersected in the South meant that we simply had to have a contribution from Dr. Ferris. So her article entitled Feeding the Jewish Soul in the Delta Diaspora, a wonderful study of Jewish foodways in the Mississippi Delta region, was added to our volume. As a result of the relationship that we established, which was really brief and primarily electronic, as you may know nowadays, I came to know Dr. Ferris's work more. And when we first began thinking about speakers for the Sam Hill Lectures 3 years ago, one of the scholars at the very top of my list was Dr. Ferris. And I was thrilled when she agreed to be our third lecturer in the series. Not only do I admire and respect her scholarship, but she brings to this series on Southern religious history a voice that I hope will always be a part of the series. It is a voice that reminds us that the story of religion in the South is a story of diversity, not only religious diversity, but ethnic diversity as well, since many Jewish immigrants to the South came from Eastern as well as Western Europe. It is a voice that reminds us that religion and culture are, more often than not, conjoined and intermingled, that Southern religion is not confined within the walls of a church, synagogue, or temple, but can be expressed as well in the everyday actions of cooking and eating. And it is a voice that reminds us that religion is not concerned merely with the actions of an ordained and predominantly male ministry, but that it oftentimes finds its most eloquent expression around a table of foods prepared by our mothers and our grandmothers. I invite you tonight now to listen to that voice, really for those voices, as you join me in welcoming Dr. Marcy Cohen Ferris.
Thank you. Can y'all hear me okay? Okay, good. It is an honor to be with you today, and a special thank you to Professors Rick Chess and to Roger Payne for arranging this visit. I'm so happy to be with you tonight, and really it's a special honor for me to deliver the Sam Hill Lecture in Southern Religious History. You know, Dr. Hill edited the religion chapter. Did I do something wrong? Okay. Dr. Hill edited the religion chapter of the Encyclopedia of Southern Culture, which is the 12-pound volume of everything Southern that was edited by my husband, Bill Ferris, who's with me tonight, and our colleague, Charles Reagan Wilson at the University of Mississippi, and that was published by UNC Press. Now, as you know, there's important documentation of Western Carolina's Jewish heritage that's taking place here in Asheville. And I want to quickly recognize the important work of the Center for Jewish Studies here at UNCA, and also of Helen Weichel, head of special collections at the Ramsey Library, which includes the Jewish Heritage Collection of Western North Carolina, historian Sheldon Nuringer of Warren Wilson, who wrote an important history of Asheville's congregation, Beth Israel, Patricia Beaver's work on Jewish Appalachia at Appalachian State, a historian, Leonard Rogoff, who is the author of the recent exhibit and publication Down Home, Jewish Life in North Carolina, and also public historians Jan Shockett and Sharon Farr of History at Hand, who documented Asheville's Jewish community in their important exhibit and publication, The Family Store, A History of Jewish Businesses in Downtown Asheville, 1880 to 1990, which is really one of the best histories of Jewish urban life in the South that I've seen. It's such an impressive history. And I'm also especially grateful for the opportunity to come to Asheville because it's my annual trip to Tops for shoes. And I would never miss it, which of course is the legacy of the Carr-Resnikoff family. So to understand how Jews have survived and even prospered in that most unlikely of places, the South, and in historic southern cities like Asheville, it's an important story. And that story has been overlooked for too long, or it's been told slowly through the lives of notable men in historic synagogues in the region's colonial Jewish settlements, such as Charleston and Savannah and Richmond, but rather than telling the story of Jewish men and women who labored to create thriving businesses and families in the Mountain South in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So Southern Jewish history, particularly using the tools of social history as we see in the family store, it really deepens our understanding of the American Jewish experience, and it helps us appreciate the very diverse expression of Jewish life across the United States. So I'm going to take you on a little journey now, this culinary journey through the American South. I'll start with the place that's kind of where I began, and begin with a quote from Flannery O'Connor, who said, "The greatest blessing a writer can have is to find at home what others have to go elsewhere seeking." And as a scholar of folklore and history, I was really blessed to discover the subject for my research in Blytheville, Arkansas, where I grew up. Isn't it fabulous? Right there, northeastern Arkansas. And this always reminds me, because I was a big fan of The Wizard of Oz, which is a story of 4 unlikely individuals, actually there's 5 because you have to include Toto, on a journey that were searching for something that they were missing. And as Dorothy discovered on that journey, she didn't have to search any further than her own backyard to find that missing thing. It was always there with her, and it was home. So my culinary research really began at the dinner table. During my childhood, some nights my plate was filled with Richie Lee King's fried chicken, and other nights with my Jewish mother's roast chicken. And as I ate at home with my Protestant friends, because that was largely what I had, at the local barbecue restaurant in Blytheville, Arkansas, the Dixie Pig, don't tell anybody, that's where we ate all the time, and at my Russian Jewish grandmother Luba's table, I gradually began to understand how these meals really defined us. So when people have asked why I've written about Southern Jewish history and food, the answer really lies in my childhood. I saw differences in how our family and others ate, and I knew that it was central to our Jewishness and to our Southernness, and also why we felt frequently like outsiders. Now, my grandmother Luba died in the 80s at age 88, and at her home in Blytheville, Arkansas, she left a recipe box and a rolling pin with which she had made noodle dough, as her mother had done in Odessa. And here was the archival evidence for my family's particular culinary DNA. There were recipes for Brer Rabbit's molasses cookies, for Mrs. Thornton Scott's cocoon cookies, and there was a hush puppy recipe that came off the back of the cornmeal box. But there were also recipes for Lillian's strudel and for Lena's mandelbrot and for her Russian blintzes. So these recipes spoke to me of my grandmother's culinary journey. There's her little recipe box. From Eastern Europe to New York to Arkansas. And that's a journey that really shaped her Jewish identity and that of my family. Now, in the early 1990s, I worked for the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience, which is now today the Institute of Southern Jewish Life in Jackson, Mississippi. And I traveled as part of my work in Alabama and Arkansas and Mississippi, and I was with photographer Bill Aaron. And we were documenting the lives of Jewish Southerners. I only wish we'd been able to come to Western Carolina. But we looked at their synagogues, at businesses, and at family life. And Bill would take the photographs, and I would do the oral histories. And before we even took out the camera bags and our equipment, out would come food, a plate of honey cake and brownies and invitations to stay for dinner. And there was just always more and more culinary and food material that was present in all of these interviews and in engagement with people. So food stories and experiences wove in and out of our travels. And Southern Jews really told us who they were with the food they ate and the places that they ate in, from white-only country clubs to meat and 3 cafes to synagogue potlucks and Jewish food festivals like your own Hard Locks Food Festival. And many years later, when I began my doctoral research, I couldn't forget those Southern and Jewish food stories. I traveled throughout the South collecting stories of special dishes like Yetta Lefkoff's Rosh Hashanah Hoppin' John from Charleston. Ann Zoller Kiefer had a great recipe for dirty matzah, which is very much like dirty rice, but it's great to make at Passover time. That was from New Orleans, like it's a savory matzah kugel. And Ann Jarash from Vicksburg had a recipe for what she called a slip and slide tort that she prepared for Seder. And she called it slip and slide. It's like a sham tort with meringue, but it was always so warm at Seder time that it would start to melt and slip and slide a little bit for a Mississippi Seder. So during my culinary road trip, I explored the history of the Jewish South during the founding of Savannah and Charleston's Jewish community in the colonial era. I looked at the impact of the Civil War on Jewish families in New Orleans. I looked at the negotiation of ethnic identity in New South Atlanta at the turn of the 20th century, and then also the isolation of the congregations where I grew up in Mississippi and Arkansas and the Arkansas Delta in the late 19th and first half of the 20th centuries, and also negotiating the worlds of rock and roll and blues and barbecue and Jewish life and Protestant fundamentalism found all mixed up together in Memphis. So each of these southern worlds reflect the constantly changing relationship between rural and urban worlds in the Jewish South, the diversity of Jewish populations who came to the South from Central and Eastern Europe, from Greece, from Turkey, and then of course our Reform or Orthodox or conservative movements in the region. So Jews adapted their culinary traditions in predominantly Christian worlds, southern worlds, where they were deeply shaped by the region's rules of race and class and gender and its history, as you can see here with little Robert E. Lee Geisenberger there on the right. His parents were a little impacted by the war. So Southern Jewish history has really simmered along for over 4 centuries. In a lot of ways, it's like a gumbo because it blends many different ingredients and many important narratives all together. There are stories like that of Confederate Jewish activist Eugenia Levy Phillips in New Orleans. There are the anti-lynching supporters like North Carolina's own Gertrude Weil, to civil rights activists Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner, who died alongside James Chaney in Philadelphia, Mississippi. So tonight we're going to briefly explore the history of the Jewish South. I'll take you on a little bit of a journey, but we'll do it from the perspective of the dinner table. And I think that I probably am telling you a history many of you know, but hopefully I'll add in a little bit more information for you related to how we can understand this history from the lens of food. So the earliest Jewish settlers in the South were descendants of Sephardic Jews who had fled the Iberian Peninsula to avoid the Inquisition. I just summed up a huge amount of history in one sentence there. But they sought religious tolerance and economic opportunity in the newly developing markets of the coastal South. And many settled in Savannah, Georgia, in founding the first Southern Jewish congregation there in 1733, and that would be Mikveh Israel. And this is what Mikveh Israel looks like today. This is the second building that was dedicated in 1878. And then the next congregation in this chronological history would be that of Charleston, South Carolina. And the congregation founded there, of course, is Congregation Beth Elohim, that was founded in 1749. So again, often this history of the Jewish South, this deep, rich history, has been ignored for a louder history of the Northeast in our country. But this is an equally important and vibrant history that must be told. So in the early South, and here's Beth Elohim in its present building today. In the early South, Jews encountered a cuisine that was shaped by the tastes of many cultures, and that's really what Southern food is all about. But at that time, it was Africa, England, France, Spain, Portugal, Germany, the Caribbean and also the culture of the American Indians living in Southeast, in the South. These first Jewish Southerners, though, faced a dilemma, as Jews have faced all over the world and in all times. How could they be Jewish in a place, thinking coastal South first, where there were no kosher butchers, no synagogues, no mikvahs, no yeshivas, and hardly any Jews? So, as Jews have always had to do, they made compromises. They made compromises to sustain religious life because of the wide range of religious observance within each Jewish community. There was a little bit of everybody with lots of different traditions, as I'm sure that's what it was like for me growing up in Arkansas, and I'm sure it's that way here in Asheville in some ways too. So from the 1820s to the 1870s, most Jews who came to the American South, of course, were Ashkenazic Jews from Central and Western Europe, and many of these immigrants began as peddlers. They brought their mercantile skills from Europe. They moved into the interior of the country. They followed the cotton market as it moved from the low country to the deep South, and they brought their food traditions with them. And they were equally affected, of course, by local tastes. I'll tell you a quick story about a 19th century Jewish peddler in Alabama who was invited to eat dinner with a local Gentile farm family. You know, peddlers would head out on maybe a Sunday, be out all week working, and especially if they were observant and kept kosher, they would try to get back to whatever town they needed to get back to be with their families for Shabbos. But here is Mr. Schwartz. He's with a Gentile family, a Christian family in Alabama midweek. They invited him to eat, and he sat down to eat. And so he was enjoying the pork roast, the black-eyed peas that were cooked with a little bit of fat back, the collard greens, his biscuit, which had a lot of lard right in it. And the farmer's wife said, "Mr. Schwartz, I thought that Moses forbid the children of Israel from eating anything from the pig." And he said, "My dear madam, if God had spoken to Moses in Perry County, Alabama, he would never have issued such an edict." And, you know, that was just so true. You know, if they had known, if God had only known what the South was going to look like. So here's another voice, Miriam Gratz Moses Cohen, actually the niece of pioneer Jewish educator Rebecca Gratz of Philadelphia, married Solomon Cohen of Georgetown, South Carolina. And in 1836, she kept a little journal that she filled with her recipes. There are recipes for biscuits and cornbread and sweet potato pudding and pound cakes, as well as Jewish recipes, of course, for her lots of Passover recipes. And not up on that page, but there are recipes for Pesach sponge cake, kugel, if you see how she spells kugel, K-O-O-G-L-E, haroseth, and Passover soup dumplings. What are Passover soup dumplings? Matzoh balls, of course. And this diary is in the collection of the Southern Historical Collection, and actually I think it's been digitized and you can look at the diary. In the 1870s, Lavinia Minus of Savannah advised her husband and her children to keep the Sabbath holy. She wanted them to follow the laws of kashrut, the Jewish dietary laws, and to participate in the rituals of Passover and other Jewish holidays. She wrote her husband in a letter, "I do not think that you will ever regret," he was a merchant and he was traveling, his name was Abram, "I don't think that you will ever regret having kept the Sabbath holy, Abram dear, although it is not more than a right-minded man should do." So she's just reminding him while he is on the road to eat properly. And while her son was studying in Kentucky at university, son Jacob, he wrote his mother back in Savannah, "I suppose you're going to send me Passover bread as you did last year, Matzoh. Please fill up the cracks with something good. If you have any good pickles, please put a few." So this great care package heading off to Kentucky from his Jewish mother. So as the South approached secession, which we're just celebrating the anniversary yesterday. Was it yesterday? The 150th anniversary? In the fall of 1860, as we were approaching this moment, and the nation was preparing for war, both well-established Southern Jewish families and also recent Jewish immigrants really embraced the Confederate cause, and they affirmed their solidarity with their white Gentile neighbors. And Jewish women participated in sanitary fairs and other events to raise money for their children. That often included making food and cakes and cookies and pies to sell. Now, from June 1861 to July of 1862, there was a wonderful diarist named Clara Solomon. She was 16 years old at the time, right when New Orleans entered into this historic moment, and she kept a diary that detailed her wartime experiences as a teenager. She was a daughter, she was a sister, she was a Sephardic Jew, a member of the Sephardic congregation. She was a member, of course, of a slave-owning family, and also a loyal Confederate. And her description of Yom Kippur in September of 1861 rings true to most Southern Jews today, and certainly if you're from New Orleans. She wrote that she dreaded taking the last bite of preserves and bread before the day's fast began. You think, I don't want this meal to finish. Her walk to synagogue was hot and disagreeable, as it is in that time of year in New Orleans. And when she finally broke her fast, Clara Solomon wrote in her diary, "I was again myself. The longest day must end." And anybody that's gone through Yom Kippur services knows that's how it feels. And during Passover in the spring of 1862, Solomon wrote in her diary, "Our matzahs are so miserably sour, I don't think I've eaten a whole one." She reluctantly wrote that she had to turn to cornbread as a substitute. "I expect before long we shall all starve." During Passover of 1865, the Jewish community of Savannah actually placed an ad in a national Jewish newspaper called the Jewish Messenger about the severe matzah crisis that they were having. And their plea was actually answered by delivery of matzah. Thousands of pounds of matzah came from both New York and Philadelphia, and I'm sure they were like, enough already. We've got enough matzah now. That's plenty. In the spring of 1864, Private Isaac Levy wrote his sister this letter. This is to his sister Leonora, and he was describing in the letter that he'd figured out that it would soon be Passover and that they were out at the battlefront, and he was actually near Adams Run, South Carolina, and he described a Seder stew that he and his brother Zeke made, and he and his brother kept kosher the entire time. They did the best they could while they were in fighting. So stories of deprivation and even starvation occurred throughout the South, of course, and it certainly affected the Jewish community during the war. The Jewish community of Columbia, South Carolina, was affected again before and after the burning of the city on February 17, 1865. There's a story about Shabbos dinner at the home of Moses Winstuck on Assembly Street, interrupted in Columbia by Union soldiers who looted the home and then burned the home. But that happened on a Sabbath evening. And shortly after the devastating burning of the city of Columbia, Eleanor Cohen, and we have all these great records and diaries, she wrote in her 1865 diary, "I never dreamed that I could be so near starvation." In the weeks following the fire, M.C. Mordecai was appointed Columbia's food administrator. He actually spoke with President Andrew Johnson to secure food during South Carolina's restoration. And his wife, Isabel Mordecai, was daughter of a grocer. So in the years following the war, really in what we think of as Reconstruction, in the urban Northeast, this is the story that usually people are most familiar with, the kind of the historic story of Jews in America, of large numbers of Eastern European Jewish immigrants settling in neighborhoods like the Lower East Side. But of course, Eastern European Jews also came south, but in smaller numbers. The completion of the railroad to mountain cities in Appalachia brought Jewish immigrants to this region, and they opened the businesses that have been documented by Jan and Sharon in the family store. And of course, that's when downtown Asheville, began to build and really became this shopping hub of Western Carolina. This was also the era that Beth HaTefillah Synagogue was organized in 1891 and affiliated with the Union of Reform Judaism in 1908, preceded by a Jewish burial ground at Riverside Cemetery. In 1896, Asheville's Orthodox Synagogue, today Beth Israel, that synagogue was founded. So it was really locked into this time period. And this is when Jewish Southerners really established themselves at the center of a white and black, rural and urban Gentile communities where they played an important, highly visible role as merchants and as traders. And within this world, it was really impossible for Jews to remain untouched by the history, the culture, the racial codes, and the foods and the folkways of the region. So Jewish immigrants brought to the South food traditions, of course, from their respective origins, countries of origin. Eastern European specialties came to Asheville, to Louisville. Alsatian, French tastes came to Memphis, to New Orleans. And of course, Sephardic tastes came as well to Montgomery and to Atlanta. And throughout the region, Jewish food traditions mixed with Southern food traditions in kitchens that were largely run by African American cooks. So in both synagogue and home kitchens, recipes for matzoh balls and sweet potato pies passed back and forth between Jewish and African American women. And we really see a bond, a complicated bond that developed because of these people, these two groups of peoples really shared marginality. Blacks because of their race, Jews because of their religion. So Sephardic Jews arrived in Georgia and Alabama from the Isle of Rhodes, from Turkey, from Greece during the first decade of the 1900s. And they arrive at a very difficult time, especially in Atlanta. Fear had been generated by the Leo Frank case, and that colored the experience of all Jews, including these new arrivals like the Sephardic Jews, and it influenced to what degree they openly expressed and felt comfortable expressing their Jewishness. Just to remind you of the story of Leo Frank, there was actually a terrific film made on Leo Frank that's just been out this last year. If you haven't seen it, be sure and see it. But Frank was a young Jewish businessman. He was from New York. He had come to Atlanta to help manage his uncle's pencil factory. And then in 1913, he was falsely accused of murdering a young white female employee named Mary Fagan. And his sentence was actually commuted by Georgia's governor, Slayton, but a group of white vigilantes, well known in the community, upstanding men at the time, kidnapped Frank from his prison cell and hung him. It was the first lynching of a Jewish man in Marietta, Georgia, which is the home of Mary Fagan, and today has a very active, thriving Jewish community in it. At the time of the trial, Aileen Fox Urey, and her name might be a little familiar. She's the mother of Alfred Urey, who wrote Driving Miss Daisy. She was a little 4-year-old girl at the time of the trial, but she remembered seeing these large black headlines in the newspaper, and she knew that something was wrong. And her parents and friends would never speak about the Leo Frank case. And she said, "He was one of ours. If he could be lynched, what about the rest of us?" Now, the Jewish community reacted in different ways to this horrific event. And in broader terms, really what this event was this entry into the New South. Sephardic Jews just arriving actually drew closer. They expressed their identity largely at the table through family and community gatherings. And this is also, again, the time of the rise in the kind of re-strengthened Ku Klux Klan at the time. Growing nativism in the early 20th century, Southern Jews again strengthened their interfaith relations, and they emulated Protestant religious practice, including how they ate. It was a time where people did not feel safe to express their ethnicity, and they tried to do as much as they could to kind of hide that ethnicity, depending on the community that they belonged to. Many Jews were excluded from white institutions, so they established their own. That's why we have so many. We see so many examples of Jewish philanthropy, including in our state. They established Jewish hospitals, orphanages, and social clubs. At Atlanta's Standard Club, this is at the Standard Club, and you can see kind of the Tony folks that are enjoying an anniversary meal in 1935 together. Luncheon fare was usually chicken salad, hot biscuits, and for dessert, peach ice cream. If a matzo ball was served, it was tiny. It was tiny and understated, delicate. This was also the era of ballyhoo, which Alfred Urey writes about in his play, The Last Night of Ballyhoo. From 1931 to the 1950s, members of Atlanta's Standard Club, one of these social clubs, sponsored what they called ballyhoo. And ballyhoo was an annual courtship weekend that was attended by college-age sons and daughters of the Reform community. The event drew Jewish youth from the best families across the South, meaning those that were of German Jewish ancestry. So this was specifically restricted to people that were from German Jewish families. But it was how you were going to meet a nice Jewish boy and girl if you were college age, and if you were at Alabama and there was nobody there, or you were at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and you couldn't meet anybody, you definitely went home for ballyhoo, and it was like all 24-hour, round-the-clock dating and dancing and getting together. And there wasn't, I've looked at a lot of the records surrounding these kind of events. This is another one that was called Falcon. It was another weekend for college-age youth that was held in the 40s in Montgomery. Food was not so important because of the round-the-clock dating. It de-emphasized ethnicity at these events. Everybody knew they were Jewish. They didn't have to talk about it. But one thing, I know that at these events they drank a lot of Coca-Cola. So I want to tell you a quick story about Coca-Cola related to food in the Jewish South. In the 1930s, Rabbi Tobias Geffen, who was the Orthodox rabbi, really considered the dean of Orthodoxy in the Jewish South. He was the rabbi of Congregation Shehereth Israel in Atlanta, and he began receiving inquiries in the 1930s about from other Orthodox rabbis across the country, of whether or not, this really important question, is Coca-Cola kosher or not? Well, who would know? You know, they guarded the recipe. That was like impossible to get it. So he approached Harold Hirsch, who was probably one of the few Jewish employees, corporate employees for professionals working for Coca-Cola. He was an attorney in charge of their legal department, and told him that he needed to know the ingredients in the secret recipe to certify whether or not it was kosher. So he was sworn to secrecy about the recipe, but Geffen published a teshuvah, or a Jewish legal response, in 1935, and he certified that Coca-Cola was kosher. And he wrote in this document, "With the help of God, I have been able to uncover a pragmatic solution according to which there would be no question or any doubt regarding the ingredients of Coca-Cola." And so they started to issue, that saying that Coca-Cola was kosher for Passover. I mean, it was more complicated than this, because first they had to figure out, was it kosher, and then what about kosher for Passover? And some ingredients did have to be changed by the company. They changed several ingredients, including they substituted cane syrup for corn syrup, and then produced this bottle cap and ads also. And now today, people really love the Coca-Cola at Passover time. It's really a big deal to try to get Coca-Cola that's made with cane syrup instead of high fructose corn syrup that they put in it today. So another place for Jewish eating and for Jewish socializing happened right here in the mountains. And of course, that's Jewish summer camps and kosher-style inns in the southern mountains. Jack Bass, who's a great Southern journalist, and his sister Ruth grew up in the small town of North South Carolina, and they would go with their parents to the Horowitz Kosher Inn and Boarding House in Hendersonville. So does that ring a bell to anybody? And there were actually 5 boarding houses at one point, and 3 of them had served kosher meals, and they would join together to support a kosher butcher in Hendersonville. But Jack Bass described it as a southern version of the Catskills. And Jewish families from small towns in South Carolina and Georgia and even North Carolina too, where they were often the only Jewish family, came to Horowitz's during the high holidays for worship at Hendersonville Synagogue, and they enjoyed these 5-course meals at the end. And I like this one story that David Shulman tells, who is the son of merchant Saul Shulman of Silva, who Sharon and Jan have also documented. And he told a great story about a Jewish New Year's at Horowitz's at the table, that Susan Lessing Lewis had a special pinafore apron that her mother made for her for the holidays that she wore to the ends Rosh Hashanah meals, and embroidered across the bib were the words, "Susan Barber wishes you a happy new year." Can you imagine wearing that? Yeah, right there. So at the mealtime, Abraham Horowitz, who was owner of the inn, rang a cowbell to bring his guests to tables that were laden with chopped liver and matzo ball soup and noodle kugel and roasted chicken. One of the last kosher-style inns in Hendersonville was Reuben's Osceola Inn, which Esther Bucksbaum of Tybee Island, Georgia, remembers as the place where I first tasted potato knishes to die for. Of course, another important Jewish institution in the mountains is Wild Acres in Little Switzerland. And I'm sure y'all know the story behind this location. I.D. Blumenthal in the early 1930s, a very successful Jewish businessman in Charlotte, bought Wild Acres from Thomas Dixon, who had purchased the property with film royalties from D.W. Griffith's controversial Hollywood epic, Birth of a Nation, which came out in 1915. It was based on Dixon's novel, The Klansman. And Dixon invested heavily in property, and after he lost a great deal of money when the stock market crashed in 1929, he was forced to sell the 1,400 acres at Wild Acres at a much reduced price. And of course now the Blumenthals bought it, and it became an important conference center for interfaith dialogue and studies. Of course, there's Camp Blue Star, founded by Atlanta brothers Herman and Harry and Ben Popkin. That began in 1948. It actually began in Georgia and then came to Hendersonville onto 740 acres there. The same year, what happens in 1948? The founding of the State of Israel. That's no coincidence. Jonathan Sarna describes this era as the crucial decade in Jewish camping, in which Jewish education was both an expression of cultural resistance after the Holocaust and also an American promise to build and uphold the Jewish people. And there were many other Jewish camps in the region too, in the mountain south. Blue Star has operated a kosher kitchen at the camp for over 60 years, longer than that. John and Jeannie Crawford were African-American cooks who actually worked for Siegel's Delicatessen in Atlanta way early on in the history of Blue Star. They oversaw the kitchen and the kosher cooking each summer. In the 1950s, Friday evening Shabbat dinners began with kiddush and challah from a Jewish bakery in Hendersonville. There was a bagel and lox brunch on Saturday mornings. That was a tradition, and fried chicken served Sunday at noon, followed by kosher hot dogs and beans on Sunday night when the cooks had their evening off. Anybody here go to Blue Star? Yes. Great. I went to a Jewish summer camp too, but it was quietly Jewish. There I am in the worst dress anyone ever made a kid wear. Camp Wakanda in 1968 in Rocky Mount, Missouri. Very different from Blue Star. We were all Jewish, but there was absolutely nothing said about our Jewishness. So we were like learning how to water ski and shoot rifles and things and be strong Jewish kids. So in the 1950s, southern cities were really shaken to their core by the violence of the civil rights era, and food certainly, and really more specifically, public eating places were at the center of these battles. Josh Evans, who's the grandson of Durham, North Carolina's Mayor E.J. Mutt Evans, he was in my class at Carolina on the Jewish South, and he reminded us how his grandfather had removed the seats at the lunch counter in his department store in Durham so that black customers, who were their major customers, could stand at the counter and be served like everybody else. And Harry Golden, who's the editor of the Carolina Israelite, had much to say about the challenges that were faced by Black and Jewish Southerners during the Civil Rights era. And he said, after all these Southern synagogue bombings, he wrote, "I think we've been doing it all wrong. I believe that if we gave each anti-Semite an onion roll with lox and cream cheese, some chopped chicken liver with a nice radish, and some brisket with a few potato pancakes, they'd give up all this nonsense." So, Harry Golden would have loved the Hard Locks Cafe Festival. He would have been like, this is what we should be doing for community relations. So church and synagogue bombings, like the bombing of the temple in Atlanta, the Hebrew Benevolent Congregation in 1958 that was dramatized, and Alfred Urey's Driving Miss Daisy, protest marches, sit-ins at lunch counters during the Civil Rights era forced Southern Jews to either openly participate in the movement or to quietly observe protest marches from the relative safety of homes and synagogues. And then following World War II, few Jewish youth really returned to the rural South after they experienced worlds outside the South during college and the military. And with the decline of downtown business districts in the 1960s and 1970s and the growth of regional discount stores like Walmart, third and fourth generation Jews were pushed out of their small mercantile businesses in the rural South and into professions located in southern cities and others outside the South. And certainly that's not a story that I need to explain here, that you've seen this firsthand in Asheville, and you've also seen great change and kind of revival happening in Asheville today. But as Jewish populations declined in the rural South, once active congregations were forced to close their doors, and it ended a long history of Jewish life in many Southern communities. But it's not the end of this story. The story of fading Jewish communities really suggests, though, an evolving and a changing Jewish landscape in the South, because growth has taken place in the urban and the Sun Belt South, great growth across North Carolina, great demise as well, and then in cities like Asheville that have been shaped by tourism as mercantile centers in the early 20th century, and also, as we're seeing today, we're contemporary, active retirees, professionals who only need a wireless internet connection to live and come enjoy an active Jewish life that exists in the western part of our state. So though the face of Southern Jewry has really changed since the 1940s, there's never been more Jews today living south of the Mason-Dixon line, and the population trends today show little signs of this growth ending. And today, if you relate that to food, there's more access in our grocery stores, even in our chain grocery stores. There's often more lines of kosher products if you choose to, if you're seeking those kinds of products, and certainly available online for kosher and also for Jewish specialty foods. So in my work, in the end, some will argue that a bagel is a bagel, it's a bagel regardless of where it is prepared, where it is eaten. But I disagree, because I look at all these things I look inside the bagel and what's behind it. A North Carolina noodle kugel, a South Carolina pot of matzo ball soup, a pan of blintzes made in Georgia. They each have distinctive tastes. And it's not, though, because of those regional ingredients. It's really about the history that I've been trying to tell you about. These dishes reflect a deep history and culture of Jewish Southerners. So I hope that you'll remember that behind every knish and mandelbrot and macaroon and kosher hot dog in the South, that there is a story that's waiting to be told. And it's a story of the rich, long history of Jewish life in our region. It's of cultural persistence, and it's of the tastes and memories of the old world mixed with the flavors and the history of the American South. And I'll thank you right there.
Time for some questions. So again, if you would like, or comments, if you would like to ask questions, we have some folks with microphones somewhere.
Who went to Blue Star again? Any good food stories about Blue Star? Yeah. Can we, right here.
I worked there in 68 and 69, and I was the head waiter, and they wanted somebody Jewish to participate in the preparation of the food, and most of the cooks were not Jewish, and so I would go in and take a little pinch of salt and throw in everything, and then they'd cook the rest of it, and it was kosher.
Oh, that's great. Was it largely an African-American staff in the late 60s? Yeah. But it was a kosher kitchen, right? Yeah, absolutely.
Florida is in the South, but it has a whole different culture.
Yeah, we lost the microphone. She was asking me, she said Florida is a part of the South, but it's like a whole nother part of the South, right? And I didn't include Florida because I just couldn't include it in the work that I was able to do. And I was also looking at a specific era and time and kind of watershed moments. But are you from Florida?
No, I know Florida has attracted a huge
Right. It does. I mean, you know, I don't know what population figures are in South Florida today, but the Jewish numbers are huge. So, you know, that really represented an important kind of Jewish food tradition for Southerners who went south to Florida, and for Southern Jews, it was their first really experience. If you didn't go to New York, you went to Miami, and you got to go to a Jewish delicatessen. And I know in Matzoh Gumbo, there are some ads from the Carolina Israelite for all the hotels in Miami that advertised, you know, send your boy a salami in the army, those kinds of things. So that's a really, really important piece. And of this history, Stephen Whitfield, who is an American Studies professor at Brandeis, has done a fair amount of work about Florida, too. Yeah, all the way in the back there. Mr. Savannah, yeah. Mr. Itzkovitz.
Northern Florida is really southern.
Yes.
Lots of small towns in North Florida that were full of, you know, not full of, but small population of Jews, most of whom owned small businesses.
Yeah. And didn't Jews from Florida also come to North Carolina resorts in the summer? Yeah, in mountain resorts.
Tallahassee and Jacksonville both have old Jewish congregations.
Right. Right there.
So you're talking a lot about how, I guess, the North kind of ignores the history, the Jewish North ignores the Jewish history of the South. Is there any evidence that like recipes were traded between Northern Jews and Southern Jews?
Yes. Well, you know, that's a great question. Because Northern Jews absolutely came south, and then there are also just classic Jewish dishes, right? There are really important classic Jewish holiday dishes that are pretty much universal, at least for Jews, depending upon what country of origin you come from. So if you made matzo ball soup, if you made a noodle kugel, if you made challah, if you made chopped liver, you made knish, it was very similar in both places. But it was after you became a part of a place that you might adapt it and add additional ingredients, or the method that you cooked. If you had an African American servant or cook who assisted in the kitchen or ran the kitchen, they would morph it a little bit or change it a little bit. But absolutely, recipes, there's kind of a core cuisine of Jewish cuisine, and you know, there's a handful of Jewish recipes that people around the world enjoy, Jewish people around the world enjoy together, but then they're very distinct recipes that come from specific places from countries of origin. Yeah, sir.
Comment. You know what a halfback is?
A halfback?
You know, not football.
Halfback.
That's a northern Jew who goes to Florida and then comes to North Carolina. It's a halfback.
That's great. That's great. I like that. Makes sense. Well, I think I'll let us in there. And I just want to thank you all so much for coming out and staying with me for this journey. I really appreciate you attending the Sam Hill lecture, and I am so grateful for being invited for this talk. And also, I'll just tell you too, I left up front, I think for each of you, there are a newsletter from the Center for Jewish Studies at Carolina. If you'd like to read a little bit about what we're doing there and hear a little bit more about the program, I'm hoping that I'll get to meet with some students here tomorrow. But again, thank you to Rick Chess and to Roger Payne.